G'day guys! I recently witnessed a few games at an event that gave me a really obvious example of a mistake that I see a lot of people make. So I wanted to share that with you today and give you some practical examples on what you can do to avoid making the same mistake that I witnessed at this recent event. It's called staying safe, and I hope you enjoy the video.
One for the Blood God.
G'day guys, I've just got back from the Risky Rollers Teams event where my team placed first, and there was a really interesting instance in one of the games that I want to talk to you about, one of the games that I observed. And it's about a critical mistake that one of the players made that I think is a learning experience that we can all sort of share. And hopefully it's something that we can all sort of learn about and make sure that we don't make similar critical mistakes in our games. So basically there was a player at the event and he was running Chaos Space Marines. He was running Emperor's Children, big unit of Terminators, Abaddon, Master of Possessions, Dark Apostle, the whole kit and caboodle. Similar in a lot of ways to the lists that I've run in the past. And so whenever I had time, I was observing his games because I was just curious to see how he piloted the list and what he did with it and how his results went, because of course, being a very similar list to my own, I found it deeply interesting. And one of the games that he played, he went up against the Salamanders army, and I watched their deployment. They were doing, I think it was table corners deployment, and basically what happened is he deployed all of his stuff out in the open on the line so that he could get up into the center as fast as possible. And when I was watching this, I was like, oh, that's a mistake, because if the Salamanders player goes first, he had a bunch of those land speeder storms or whatever they are, the ones with the missiles and all that sort of stuff, and a bunch of other DACA, and I was like, even if you're just able to go forward and kill, 3 or 4 Terminators before they get their buffs up, that's Terminators that you're losing that you don't really need to lose. Those Terminators could be hidden in a ruin somewhere, because it was a relatively heavy table. So I was a bit nervous on his behalf just watching that deployment. I was like, oh god, this could be bad. But then he got lucky and he rolled up, got first turn, so he was able to get his buffs up and move up into the table. And when he did this, he moved forward, then used Honor the Prince to advance his 6, so he got maximum movement, and he moved every Terminator their maximum distance, so that they were as far forward into the center of the table as possible. And then he basically moved his Demon Prince up with them, so that he could cast his Warp Ritual and start scoring victory points, and had the Terminators postured in the center of the table. And when he did this, I was like, I don't think he understands the damage capacity of those Salamanders. And then when he's going to cast his Delightful Agonies, he has failed that psychic power. And I was just like, this is game over. Absolutely game over. Because without Delightful Agonies, those Salamanders are going to kill all those Terminators. And, that came to pass. Like the Salamanders player that had his turn, he moved in. Salamanders have a lot of flame. The list had a lot of flamers in it. And a lot of access to reroll wounds. And as a result, the trans hitman meant not much, and he was able to just go in and just blast away those Terminators with, high AP flamers. And when I spoke to the player, the Chaos Space Marines player, after the event, after the match, I was like, yeah, I was watching your game, and I think the mistake that you made was moving those Terminators as far forward as they can be and exposing them, because the thing is there was a little L-shaped ruin just off the center that he very easily could have moved all of those Terminators into, and then they would have been out of line of sight and out of range to all of that damage. So I was like, what you probably should have done, and this is something that a lot of people probably forget, is that yes, those Terminators are one of the toughest units in the entire game, but in 9th edition particularly, that's not good enough. Being that tough isn't good enough. You're still gonna take heavy casualties if you can be seen. So the idea here, and the sort of the lesson here, is that if you have the option to remain obscured and not shot at all, whilst still more or less achieving what you need to, which in this case was advancing into a position where you could launch an attack turn 2, then you should always opt for being not visible. Not letting them shoot you at all is of course better than letting them shoot you. Even if you are one of the toughest units in the game, being shot is never something that you want to happen. And I think the thing here is, in his mind, he was thinking, well, my game plan is go at him as fast and hard as possible and get my warp ritual. So I want to start scoring warp ritual from turn 1 so that I can guarantee that I'm getting those points. And I want to move as hard and fast as possible in his direction so that he can't run away. Because one of the things that people often do to the Chaos Space Marine Terminators is they just run away. They know your Terminators are relatively slow, so they just hide from you. But the trick that he missed here was that this was a 5 objective mission, Table Quarters, and he was able to position himself right next to that central objective with these Terminators in a L-shaped ruin that would mean he would be out of line of sight. And positioning yourself there, right next to that central objective, achieves more or less the same thing as if you went full Honor the Prince and went deep. And so the idea here is what he should have done, in my opinion, is instead of going with the game plan of I'm just going to get up in his grill, do as much damage as I possibly can, and get myself in a position where he can't run away. There's not much point making it so your opponent can't run away from the Terminators if the result of that is that your opponent actually just kills the Terminators, because then they don't need to run away. So what he should have done is, knowing that the Emperor's Children Terminators have one of the deepest threat ranges of Chaos Space Marine Terminators, because they can advance with Honor the Prince, then they can put advance and charge on them from their chaplain or from your apostle, and then you can obviously charge again using Honor the Prince. Like, you can get in real deep with your Terminators. He should have just moved them as far forward as he can be whilst simultaneously remaining out of line of sight, because then for sure that next turn you are definitely going to have all of those Terminators alive, and you're going to be able to then spring forward from that position. And if your opponent moves in such a way that, again, you're not able to get those charges on them, all you do is the same thing. You just move and Honor the Prince into the next position where you're still safe, and they, then in their turn, they're going to have to move away again. And basically you use the Terminators to bully them and push them around the table, and push them and funnel them into your other units. This is one of the ways that I make it so that people can't hide from the Decimators in my Black Legion list, is I go, cool, the Terminators are coming at you from this angle. If you go that direction, you're going to get hit by Terminators. But if you go this other direction, you're exposing yourself to my Hellbrutes and my Decimators. And that way, the opponent really just doesn't have any good choices. You put people in between two bad decisions, and that's how you win the game. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, well, if you're doing this, what's the point of all the defensive buffs that we're putting on these Terminators? Because we're putting a lot of points worth of, investment and command point investment into making these Terminators as tough as absolute possible. And you're probably thinking, well, why do that if you're going to be just hugging cover as tightly as possible so that you're not getting shot anyway, so those defensive buffs are kind of irrelevant, right? And the point there is that you're not always going to be able to hug cover perfectly. You're also going to go up against opponents that are combat heavy, in which case they're going to be charging you, in which case the cover provides no value. And you're also going to go up against players that are just really fucking fast. Like, there might be an Eldar army or something like that have really, really high movement characteristics on their stuff. So they're going to be able to shoot you even if you try to hide. So not every army you're going to be able to do this to. So that's why you need those defensive buffs built in. And then there's also the turns where, say he moved up into that central ruin, and then the opponent went, well, it's 5 objectives. I need to control that central objective at some point. Otherwise, I'm just not going to score my primary. So he goes, cool, I'm going to move a bunch of really tough stuff in, and hopefully, when he charges me, I'll overwatch him, kill a couple Terminators, then there'll be a big punch on, I'll lose a bunch of stuff, but he'll lose a bunch of stuff, and then I'll control the objective because he doesn't have objective secured, and, the Salamanders player did, so the Salamanders player may have decided to try to posture up and take the center, So if that happens, you would then go, cool, I'm going to put all of my defensive buffs on and I'm going to charge in. And now in the next turn, I'm going to be in the open. So I need those defensive buffs, but I will have done a bunch of damage. So you do need the defensive buffs for those times when your opponent gives you a sufficient reason to be in the open. Then you want to make sure you have the defensive buffs. But I think a lot of players, when they get the Chaos Space Marines list, they get way overconfident with the durability of that unit. And I've made that mistake plenty of times before, which is why I'm able to sort of see the way that this mindset works. Is you go, nah, I've got all my buffs, I'm the toughest unit in the game. You move out into the open, and then you're like, wow, I just got absolutely blasted by this guy. So I've been on that side of the equation before, and seeing it happen and talking to this guy about what his decision process was, I was just like, oh my God, this is a more common problem than I may have initially thought. And I wanted to sort of share that with you guys. So essentially the cliff notes are, never provide your opponent with a target that you don't have to. You know, if you don't have to be in the middle, don't be in the middle. If you don't have to be out in the open, don't be out in the open. You know, you only want to do that when you absolutely have to. And this is something that applies every army, doesn't matter what you're playing, and it doesn't really matter what you're playing against. You know, it's the same when you're versing a combat army. Never be within charge range of them unless you have to be, you know. So if there's like an objective that you have to do an action on and that would result in you being out in the open or would result in you being within charge range, then sure, you have to do it, right? But if you've got something like Warp Ritual where you get 5 turns and you only have to do it 3 times, you don't have to be there this turn, you know. So there's no reason to put yourself out in the open and just die in order to score like 3 victory points for Warp Ritual. Like, just hold. You can score that later when your opponent is dead. Make sure you don't die. And all you have to do in order to do that is be outside of his line of sight or outside of his range or outside of his charge threat range. So that's the first sort of part to this. And then the other part to this is just don't overestimate the durability of your units and never underestimate the damage output of theirs. This is a mistake that I made recently at the ANZTC. I basically went up into the center of the table to start doing my Warp Ritual with similar theory here. And I got charged by 2 units of Aberrants. And the Gene Steel Cult player on my team for that event told me that Aberrants were bad. And I thought that meant they don't do damage, but they do a lot of damage. And they managed to kill all my Terminators. And I was in a very similar position that this Emperor's Children player was in, where I was just like, oh no, now I've lost all my Terminators turn 1. This is a huge problem. So yeah, essentially talking the same thing here, where it's like, well, what I should have done is I should have gone, well, do I have to be in the center now? And do I have to be all the way in the center, or can I just toe in on it? Like, I could have probably towed in with one of my characters, with a sorcerer, towed in with a bunch of Terminators to make sure he couldn't be shot, but been further away from the enemy than I was. Whereas instead, I basically put a big ring of them surrounding the objective, hoping that way he won't be able to get on the objective to contest it. And that was a huge mistake of mine, because then he was able to charge me with both units of Aberrants and just absolutely butcher my Terminators. Whereas had I done it differently, he may have only got 1 unit of Aberrants into combat, or maybe neither units of Aberrants would have made combat, and then I would have had a round of shooting into the Aberrants before charging the Aberrants, and then I get to fight first. So it would have been a massive swing in the other direction had I respected his unit and not overestimated the durability of my own unit. So that's sort of the lesson here, I think. Is basically, it's a combination of never underestimate your opponent and never overestimate yourself. Always play the game as cagey as permitted. So always stay as safe as you can be, stay out of charge ranges, stay out of line of sight, unless the mission dictates that you must go somewhere. In which case, if you must do it, well, then you don't really get a choice, right? That's the definition of must. So stay safe, people. And thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers. Alrighty guys, thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, make sure to head over to blogforthebloodgod.com where you can show your support for this channel. You can pick up merchandise like these shirts. I've got objective markers, I've got dice, I've got battle mats, I've got all kinds of really cool merchandise available on that website, and that's a really great way that you can show your support for the channel. Also, if you want to join the Patreon and the Discord community, that's a really good way that you can show your support whilst getting one-on-one coaching with myself. So either way you want to go, we've got you covered over on blogforthebloodgod.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
Blog for the Blood God.